Social Justice Ireland's Michelle Murphy, research and policy analyst, discusses the issue of sustainability. What is sustainable development?
Sustainable development is defined as development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So it encompasses three areas: environment, society and economy. And sustainable development requires us to recognise that our natural resources are not just for our own use, they're for future generations. So it's up to us to protect and enhance these resources to hand over to future generations. So the point of sustainable development is that it should be resource efficient, it should take a long-term view, and it should think about the needs in the future, not necessarily just the needs that we have now.
And what sort of policy proposals could promote sustainable development?
Well, policy proposals to promote sustainable development would be policy proposals that take into account the social, the environmental and the economic and give them all equal consideration. For example, one simple thing would be to have shadow or satellite national accounts. At the moment we just measure GDP, GNP, but shadow or satellite national accounts, as they're known, also measure the cost of resource depletion. They take into account how much your natural resources are worth to the economy. In Ireland, it's worth 2.6 billion annually. That's what our biodiversity is worth. So this would be accounted for in our national accounting system alongside everything else. And the cost of depleting those resources or not protecting them is factored into the account system as well. So we can see what is happening to our natural resources, so that everything, the cost of everything, for example, climate change, could be factored in. And we would have an accurate picture of our national accounts. And then if we are accounting for something or measuring it, it also means we are cognizant of this in our policy proposals and we take a more long-term view.
What are the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions?
The largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland are agriculture, then you have the energy industries, and followed by transport. And the transport sector is actually the fastest growing source of emissions, but agriculture is still our largest source of emissions. So that creates a challenge for Ireland, because we have targets in the Europe 2020 strategy and beyond in terms of reducing our carbon emissions, becoming a more sustainable society. But on the other hand, we also have a Food Harvest 2020 target, which proposes a 50% increase in milk production, for example, and other proposed increases in agricultural output. These increases will, by their nature, mean more agricultural activity, which will produce more emissions. So the challenge for Ireland is, how do we have a more sustainable agricultural production process in order to meet the targets we've set ourselves as part of Food Harvest 2020? But also, how do we meet our targets in terms of reducing emissions? So it's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge for the agricultural industry in order to change their production methods. But there's also a challenge there for the energy industries and the transport industries as well, to reduce their emissions and to develop cleaner methods of providing transport and energy.
What impact is climate change having internationally?
Well, it's having a huge impact. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report outlines the global impact of climate change and the effect that it's having on our planet and on our climate system. So what we see is that the global ocean surfaces are warming and will continue to warm throughout the 21st century. Our sea level rise is projected in more than 95% of the ocean area, and 70% of the coastlines in the world are going to experience sea level change. So that's going to have a huge impact on the people living in those areas and on how coastal areas are managed and structured and the demographics of those areas. Global surface temperature change for the end of this century is likely to be between 1.5 degrees and 4.5 degrees Celsius, which is huge. It's very likely that we will have heat waves. We have had an increased precipitation, so increasing wet weather here. We're having increasingly unpredictable weather, and this will continue. And because of the cumulative emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases, global surface warming will continue beyond the end of the 21st century, even if we stop emissions now. So it's a huge challenge to us, both in Ireland and to the international community, to actually address the issue of climate change and to acknowledge the impact it's having on countries and societies across the world, and to actually put in place policies that will limit the impact of climate change.
And finally, what potential impact could it have on Ireland and Ireland's environment?
The impact is set out in terms of rising sea levels, but also in terms of increased precipitation, so increasing rain. And we've seen that over the past number of years. That will have an impact on agriculture, on harvesting, on fodder, on animals, and in terms of meeting agricultural targets in the Food Harvest 2020 strategy and beyond. The changes in sea temperature will obviously impact on our fishing industry. The changes in sea levels will impact on our coastlines and communities based on our coastline. And the unpredictable weather patterns as well mean we'll have more examples of the flooding that we had in 2013 and early 2014. So all of this will have an impact on our infrastructure and on our natural resources. There will be a cost to the policies that we have to implement to deal with the climate change process. So we will have to put resources into this area in order to mitigate against the impact of climate change. And this will require difficult decisions both nationally and internationally.